Good afternoon. It's Monday, the 18th of November 2019, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. I'm your host, Mike Robinson. Joining me in the studio today, Patrick Henningsen from 21st Century Wire. Welcome to the programme once again, Patrick.
Oh, great to be with you, Mike.
Okay, well, we're going to get started, of course, with Prince Andrew and the interview that was done on Saturday evening on Newsnight. And, well, no real surprises here. He didn't have any answers for the questions. There was some. We did ask on Friday whether the questions were going to be hard-hitting enough, whether they had actually been set by the palace, and that remains a good question. What's clear though is that no matter where the questions came from, he didn't have any answers. His justification for, or his claim that he was not with the 17-year-old female that he is in a photograph with. He says that he was at Pizza Express instead with his children. Quite amazing. Nobody seems to remember being at Pizza Express. Pizza Express hasn't made any statement, but anyway, that's where he was, according to him. The other thing that he said, of course, that was quite interesting was this: I have a peculiar medical condition, which is that I don't sweat, or I didn't sweat at the time. I didn't sweat at the time because I'd suffered what I would describe as an overdose of adrenaline in the Falklands War when I was shot at. So his explanation for why the various people that are making claims against him couldn't be correct is that one of the claims was that he was sweating a lot, and he says that he couldn't possibly be sweating a lot. Well, in fact, this really goes against the medical advice. Symptoms of adrenaline overdose may include numbness or weakness, severe headache, blurred vision, pounding in your neck or ears, sweating, chills, chest pain, fast or slow heartbeats, severe shortness of breath, or cough with foamy mucus. The information that we've received this morning from a doctor is I wouldn't imagine that a surge in adrenaline would cause hypohidrosis, lack of sweating, long-term or otherwise. So this doesn't seem to stack up. Of course, one of the other things that he said in the interview was that he wasn't a party sort of guy. He didn't go around partying too much. He certainly didn't have public displays of affection. And social media over the weekend and the mainstream media this morning full of video footage and photographs of Prince Andrew showing public shows of affection and at parties. So nothing really seems to stack up. He has apparently told the Queen that it all went very well, that he's extremely happy with how it went, but the general consensus on the front pages of the media this morning is that he made a complete hash of it. And this was what they're describing as a PR disaster. So the question is why he would put himself into this position in the first place. According to Emily Maitlis this morning, the interviewer from the BBC, it took them, well, she'd announced last week that it took them 6 months to get this interview organised. This morning she said that in fact they began the process a year prior, and that Prince Andrew had received permission from the Queen to go ahead and do it eventually. But nonetheless, it seems a bit strange. But look, the question is the royal family and their links to child abuse, of course, aren't limited to Prince Andrew and this, but Prince Andrew's attitude to child abuse in general, we questioned quite some time ago. Now, in 2011, we published this article, Accusations of Student Abuse and Child Pornography Cover-Up at Oxford and Cherwell Valley College. And this turned into a series of articles of pretty serious abuse of children at the college. And this was a letter written to the principal, Sally Dickett's, at the time. The images are being shown by Andy was one of the teachers, by Andy's friends, are quite worrying. And basically going on to say it's not normal porn, it's child porn that's being shown in the school. The complaints that Steve has received about John Guyver showing child abuse videos in class. The videos being shared around the other tutors. Somebody has complained to Steve with other students and has made written complaints with him. Something needs to be done about this, as I can't handle this anymore. That was a letter to the principal from one of the students at the time. Of course, quick as a flash, nothing was done about it. This is the principal of the school at the time, and still the principal of the school, Sally Dickett's. Well, why are we mentioning this now? Because in 2012, Prince Andrew visited the school. In fact, he visited the campus, the specific campus where the abuse was going on, and Prince Andrew's PA was alerted by the UK column that this had taken place, that these abuse allegations were outstanding, and asked Prince Andrew whether he would be willing to consider not paying that visit, that it wasn't appropriate. And in fact, he went anyway, as you would imagine. Now, so the question is, what is the royal family's attitude towards people that are abusive and to abuses that's taken place? The other question that needs to be asked once again is what connections the royal family had, for example, to Jimmy Savile and others that are involved in these types of activities. Prince Andrew doesn't seem to have answered any of the questions.
Well, the BBC, a lot of people are saying that they're finally doing real journalism, and that they're holding this interview up as a great example of how useful the BBC can be on big important issues. But if they had been waiting a year to organize this sit-down one-on-one interview, I was expecting that Emily Maitlis might ask Andrew about why Jeffrey Epstein paid the debts of his wife at the time, Sarah Ferguson. That seems to be a really important detail in this whole story, because if you lend somebody, quote, a loan that will never be paid back, £7 million or dollars, then there's an implication of some loyalty there, I would think, to your friend. Or your friend will have some sway or hold over you, some influence over you, and might want a favor in return, for instance. I mean, there's all sorts of possibilities there, but that didn't even come up, that whole subject, and that seems to be central to the relationship there, in terms of why would Andrew hang around with a guy like Jeffrey Epstein unless he felt compelled to, not only for reasons that are being implied, but there's a deeper relationship there.
So he was asked why, after Epstein had been convicted, he went and visited him once again, rather than just making a phone call and saying we can no longer associate together. And his reason was that he's too honourable, and that a phone call, in his opinion, wouldn't have done it. Does that seem...
Well, he also said that it was convenient, quote, convenient to stay at the mansion. I assume he was talking about New York. Which is a kind of a flimsy excuse, really. But the whole thing was just a complete disaster on so many levels, this interview.
So where do you think he goes from here? Because it seems to me there is nowhere for him to go at this point.
Well, I think the two points have been brought up by a lot of people out there. One is that by doing this interview, Andrew has absorbed a tremendous amount of heat on behalf of the establishment. When I say the establishment, I'm talking about everybody else in Jeffrey Epstein's black book. There's a lot of names in there, a lot of relationships. And so Andrew, being a British royal, he's seen to be untouchable in that sense. So he would be one of the sort of prime candidates who would come up and take all the flack up front, and then the story will be buried after that. It's more or less buried now with Jeff Epstein, but it'll be further buried now that Andrew's taken that heat on behalf of the establishment. The other point that's not been brought up by a lot of people is that there might be an ongoing investigation or a court case whereby the FBI could be involved, or something like this, where someone like Andrew could be compelled to be held under question or to testify or something like this. And by doing this big media event, it might sort of dilute or change that sort of process legally in terms of what he's compelled or not compelled to do, because he's already made his public statement. He certainly can't be held in contempt of court in the U.S. I wouldn't think so anyway. But there might be some other strategy at play here to do with ongoing investigations or a lawsuit by Virginia Roberts Giuffre. So there's a few different possibilities there. We'll soon find out, probably.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's move on. If you like what the UK Column does and you'd like to support us, then please head over to ukcolumn.org/community. there are options for supporting us there, and your support much needed and appreciated. Now, on Friday, we were mentioning the Intelligence Security Committee of Parliament, their report Russia, which had been sent to the Prime Minister, written in March, but sent to Boris Johnson on the 17th of October 2019, and the furore about the fact that Boris refuses to make this report public. Well, Boris, if you remember, had said this, that there is no evidence for Russian election interference. And I think we've got to be very careful before we simply cast aspersions of everyone who comes from a certain country just because of their nationality. Well, I'd be interested in your thoughts, Patrick, on why you think Boris hasn't published this yet. We said that, well, of course, there have been allegations for quite some time about the amount of money that the Conservative Party has received from certain Russian interests. But the point we were firmly making on Friday was that those Russian interests are not Putin interests.
Sure, they're not Putin interests. The money, one could make the argument, because no one's raised the alarm before, there's been Russian money pouring into the Conservative Party for years, and all of a sudden it's a problem. So why Boris Johnson, why it's in the Tories' best interest to submerge this report at this time isn't necessarily because there's any damning implications of Kremlin connections to Johnson. It's because there's an election coming up in 3 weeks. And so it would be disadvantageous to Boris Johnson's campaign to release the report, because then the press would just use it as a feeding, the Remain press will use it as a feeding frenzy, basically. But I'm sure on closer examination, based on the authors of this report, and it's an all-star cast, really. Christopher Steele, leading fantasy fiction writer, former MI6 agent. Bill Browder, a known fraudster and money launderer extraordinaire who has now pledged his services to the new Cold War. And of course, the Integrity Initiative, who have been spinning up fake Russian stories now for years, funded by the Foreign Office. So that's the authors. Those are the main sources of information from what we've gathered for this report. So based on that, I would think there's not much in there in terms of substance, but a lot in terms of fluff and pap, you know, Russiagate, Russophobia, pap, Russiagate UK, absolutely, 100%. Worse than Russiagate in the US, because it's so ridiculous after Russiagate has collapsed in the US that they would try to revive this conspiracy theory here in the UK. But why?
That's a good question.
But why now?
Now, you mentioned Integrity Initiative, and of course, one of the names that appeared on the Integrity Initiative leaked documents was Carol Cadwallader. Well, over the weekend, she published this article in The Observer, revealed ex-KGB agent met Boris Johnson at Italian party. And she's saying that the Russian billionaire says there's nothing unusual in meeting the then Foreign Secretary. She says Boris Johnson met an ex-KGB agent during the highly controversial trip to attend a party 2 days after attending a high-level NATO summit that focused on Russia. The Observer can reveal the Prime Minister, who was Foreign Secretary at the time, met Russian billionaire and businessman Alexander Lebedev, whose family owns Britain's Independent and Evening Standard newspapers, following a summit of foreign ministers in Brussels staged in the wake of the poisoning of ex-Russian agent Sergei Skripal. The two met in Italy in April 2018, a month after the attack using the Novichok nerve agent in Salisbury, when Johnson, in what appears to be a highly unusual break with protocol, apparently left behind his personal security detail and flew to a lavish party at a palazzo near Perugia, hosted by Lebedev's son, Evgeny. While the meeting with Evgeny Lebedev was confirmed to The Guardian in September, Alexander Lebedev denied meeting Johnson. So that was what she was saying in the article. And then this morning, yesterday, she was pushing out a series of tweets. And so I thought we'd just run through these. This makes quite a thread, Patrick.
I'm glad you're showing these, because she blocked me this morning, actually, after I retweeted this with a comment, hashtag Integrity Initiative. But go ahead, let's have a look.
Absolutely. So breaking, Boris Johnson flew to Italy without security detail and met ex-KGB agent 2 days after NATO summit to discuss Russia's sanctions. News stories from me and Mark Townsend. That was in The Observer. She went on to say Guardian reported previously how Johnson attended party at Evgeny Lebedev's Italian palazzo. It was him alone and looking like he was about to be sick on the tarmac. Today, we report that earlier that day, Evgeny's father, Alexander, an ex-KGB agent, flew in from Moscow to meet him. And then she said, here's what Bill Browder says about ex-KGB agents. There's no such thing as an ex-KGB agent. And she goes on to say, Alexander Lebedev retired as a lieutenant colonel from the London station. He lives in Moscow and runs businesses across Russia. To do so, he must be loyal to Putin, says Browder. Well, Browder must know that is...
Of course, we can't question the authority of Bill Browder, who's wanted in Russia for fraud on a massive tax scheme and money laundering and all sorts of things. We can't question the authority of this man. I mean, why? His character is absolutely unimpeachable.
But the whole suggestion by Carol Cadwalader, she must know that that's nonsense.
Yeah, my source is Bill Browder. He knows. He feeds us everything we need to hear and want to hear about all things Russian. And he does that in the UK, and he does that in America too. Nobody questions Bill Browder, and they bought his Magnitsky story, hook, line, and sinker. And even today, the U.S. State Department spokesperson issues a nice little propaganda video you'll see on Twitter saying that Sergei Magnitsky was a lawyer, right off the top. He was never a lawyer, didn't pass a bar exam. He was an accountant. He worked for Bill Browder. He was detained because they were investigating tax fraud by Bill Browder. That's why Sergei Magnitsky was detained in the first place. It wasn't because he blew the whistle on government corruption. But you can see how this myth has managed to make its way through the establishment and the press, and everyone uses it and recycles it. It's like a Christmas fruitcake that gets passed around every year and ends up in everybody's freezer year after year, the same exact thing recycled.
So then she went on to say this is where he was at this NATO summit, that he had slipped his security detail and flew to Russian's house to meet ex-KGB agent. She seems to need to keep repeating this because maybe people aren't getting it. And then she said the recklessness of this is off the charts. Russia had just deployed a banned chemical weapon on Britain's streets. A woman would later die. Britain responded by expelling 23 Russian spies. Boris Johnson was Foreign Secretary. Dealing with this was literally his job. So what's going on here, Patrick? This is the timing of this very interesting in the middle of the election. Definitely an effort by the Integrity Initiative crowd to tar Boris Johnson with the Russian brush. Do you view this as being a Remain operation?
Well, you have to look at who's pushing what, and the timing of this, the aggressiveness of this attack shows that this is absolutely to damage Boris Johnson, 100%. It can be translated no other way. Carol Cadwalader was the star actress in a so-called documentary. It wasn't really a documentary, but it was called The Great Hack, I believe, and it was about Cambridge Analytica. But the subtext of this documentary that was lauded in the liberal left intelligentsia, especially, is that the Russians interfered in the Brexit referendum and the Brexit process. That's the subtext of this film. That's the main point that gets hit home. Okay, Cambridge Analytica is, in a way, is a distraction on many levels. It's about implicating the Russians. So Carol Cadwalader, that's her job basically, is to do, Russia hysteria. And so is she a Remainer? Is the Integrity Initiative a Remain organization? Who funds the Integrity Initiative? Comes from the
Foreign Commonwealth Office.
Are they more Remain or are they more Brexit? The Cabinet Office has to be.
Well, they are 100% Remain.
So there could be your answer right there, is that there is a schism or a split within the government. This has nothing to do with parties per se. This has to do with policy, okay? And there's a schism in the United States. There's a split, and it's not necessarily to do with parties either. It has to do with policy. It has to do with long-term foreign policy, security policy, intelligence sharing, etc. Okay, so the Remain camp clearly would benefit from this campaign that you're seeing right now in the press. So we're not saying that we know this for sure. We're just going by what we're reading here. So that's my observations.
I think that's absolutely right. Okay, let's move on then to Hong Kong. Patrick.
Well, the fight for democracy in Hong Kong continues. And here's the latest. It seems to be all coming to a head. The Hong Kong protesters make the last stand as police close in on besieged university. This alone is funny straight off the bat because the students earlier in the week said they're barricading the university, and now they're claiming that they're under siege. So a little bad planning there by the Joshua Wong's army. But there they are, and you can see how the Washington Post is trying to frame this story. You can see supposedly this is a policeman from China there, heavily geared up, and then there's this poor student here wearing a gas mask falling down. So this is the narrative that the Washington Post, that the U.S. government, that the CIA is pushing through the media, through the Bezos Post. And so that's how this looks on pretty much all of the Western mainstream media coverage. So let's take a look at what else is happening here, how the activists are involved. Here's Joshua Wong. He is front running this whole operation here, and he says time is running out, and this is the urgent cry of protesters barricaded or under siege at the Polytechnic University there. They're running out of food and medical supplies. They're starving. The narrative is one that's very familiar, okay? But normally in war zones and films and things like this. So this is a totally staged event that's been designed to play out exactly as we're seeing it right now. And there's a video with this that Joshua Wong posted this is the student inside, the great message saying, "Hello, international community, please help us." So see if we can roll this video and have a listen.
Hello, international audience from all over the world. Thank you for paying attention to what's happening in Hong Kong, especially what's happening in Hong Kong Polytechnic University right now. We are students who are protecting our campus, and the police are surrounding us and doing all those kind of violent measures to arrest us or to make sure that we can't get out of the campus anymore. We have no water supply, no food supply, and we just knew that our energy supply were being cut off as well. And there's no way out. The police are outside firing tear gas, rubber bullets, and maybe live rounds towards us when we have barely nothing to protect ourselves against them. All we have is only our face masks, goggles, and umbrellas. That's all we have right now. That's all we have left. So please do help us and do whatever you can to help us to get through this challenge. And yeah, there's no way out for us. We really need your help in order to get out of this campus and try to avoid any brutal consequences that we are facing right now. Thank you.
Okay, straight off the bat, it's ridiculous. It's ridiculous. Why does she need to cover up like this? Where was this filmed? When? You actually don't know. But this is the sort of middle-class, State Department-backed version of Bana of Aleppo, basically, being pushed out on social media. And so this is the pro-democracy movement that has been setting fire to buildings, that have just pummeled a 70-year-old man with a brick just recently in the last couple of days. A number of other...
set someone on fire and
set somebody on fire.
Yeah.
So this is the pro-democracy movement. They don't have any actual platform as to what they want other than regime change. So the champion of this, of course, is Joshua Wong, and he is the sort of the ringleader. So let's look at, he's a champion of democracy. Let's look at Joshua Wong, the champion of democracy. This is just a few weeks ago. There he is with Nancy Pelosi, the Democratic House Speaker, the leader of the House on the Democratic side. And there he is with the neoconservative war hawk, Marco Rubio, who funds and backs various coups around the world. on behalf of special interests and the U.S. government. So imagine the Chinese are looking at things like this being released all the time, all these photo ops with U.S. leaders, and they're allowing this guy to come back and basically organize or to, be a ringleader and so forth. So is it a real democracy movement? No, it's 100% backed by the United States, by the National Endowment for Democracy, by the U.S. State Department, with probably full backing of U.S. intelligence agencies. So this is what's run. The whole world sees this. There's no hiding it. So let's look at what sort of democracy Josh Wong is into right now. Have a look at this. This is quite shocking. And there you go. And this is CNN, by the way. So this is not alternative media. Even CNN's admitted gas canister at the entrance of the university, covered with bolts and nails. Okay, with a fuse on it. Okay. Now, if this is what the students are doing, if this is what Joshua Wong's democracy movement is doing, what would they call this in the UK or in a European country or in the US? What would they call this sort of act?
Terrorism.
They would call it terrorism. And I cannot find this word anywhere associated with this movement of arsonists and anarchists that have been running riot, basically, for the last few months.
Only in the Chinese press, and of course the Chinese press are being criticized for that.
For using the word terrorist.
Yes.
So what else do we call that, really? So anyway.
And similar things going on in Iran, Patrick. So this is the news today from Al Jazeera. Iran's protest, all you need to know in 600 words. So they're saying that the protests in Iran have happened organically as a result of an announcement at midnight on the 15th of November, saying that fuel prices were going to rise. They argue that in Iran, the price of fuel is considered a right, a birthright, really, that you don't have to pay huge amounts of money for fuel. So they're talking about a 50% rise in fuel that was agreed by the Supreme Council of Economic Coordination, that this has sparked demonstrations in towns and cities across Iran, with cars being abandoned on roads to block the roads, protesters blocking roads with their bodies as well. 87,000 people taking part in the protests, according to security officials who were quoted by the Fars news agency. Banks and shops set on fire or damaged, and 1,000 arrests made so far. And then this morning, apparently, the Revolutionary Guards have warned the protesters that decisive action will be taken if the protests against the hikes of the fuel hikes don't stop. So what's the Russians been saying about this? Well, here we go. Here is Zamir Kabulov. The situation in there is already difficult and tense, and of course, significant increase in gasoline prices has added fuel to the flame. And he went on to say, meanwhile, foreign forces are also working actively. And so the question is, Patrick, foreign forces are also working actively. This is a continuation of the moves to deal with Iran. Regime change has definitely been in the air for quite some time from the EU and the US. Are we starting to intervene directly now?
I think it's absolutely true that it's a very tense situation socially and economically in Iran, 100%. The fuel rise put them at it's expensive for them. It wouldn't be expensive for us, 50 cents a liter.
Yes.
Or 50p a liter, okay. It's 5 times cheaper there because they have heavy subsidies on fuels. But this is going into the winter, and their currency's in free fall. Any rise to any basic thing is going to increase your monthly overhead by lots and lots of money. So even a cup of coffee there is horrendously overpriced in places. So the pain's there, the economic pain is there. And so anything could set it off. What's interesting is at what point the U.S. will come in to hijack or co-opt any of these protests, and that's the X factor. And this is what we're always looking at. We're always analyzing in Lebanon, but also in Chile and in Bolivia and all of these places where there's
Right.
different things going on. At what point does that happen? This is a very difficult thing in Iran for the United States because a lot of those access points have been cut off. They've kicked out the NGOs. They do pay attention to social media there, their security services and so forth. They're very aware of outside corruption and influence coming in and forces and to, pervert whatever political movements are going on. So they're completely aware of this, as are other countries. Egypt is also quite au fait with this. They've kicked out scores of NGOs, as have Russia and other countries as well. So it's going to be tough. You'll see it online. They could torch some buildings. They burned a bank, a local First National Commercial Bank there. But how can it get traction widely? And I don't know. It's more difficult for the U.S. To do this in Iran than in other countries. But that said, Mike, it is also ripe for unrest because the economic situation is very, very difficult there.
So this is one that we've got to watch pretty carefully. I mean, do you think that does the Iranian government have the support of, set aside the economic issues from a political point of view, does the Iranian government have the support of the general public?
They absolutely have the support of the general public. What they don't have a majority of support in, though, is the sort of millennial internationalist people who identify sort of international millennials who are on social media and Twitter and places like Iran using VPNs.
So these are younger people?
Younger people who want to, they're definitely going in a different direction than the traditional guard in that country.
Right.
But they are not even the majority amongst the youth. But their image is amplified on social media, and then it's re-amplified by the Western media outlets boosting whatever's going on, as we saw this week. It looked like the whole country was basically being burned down. If you looked at Twitter, in reality, you saw the numbers there. Not very impressive. But I was getting shot at with tweets by Iranian democracy activists saying the world will shake, and they show me, a few thousand people underneath an underpass saying they want the Ayatollah, Khomeini to go. He must go, and they're saying we're ready. And so it could snowball into something, but I don't think it's enough for critical mass. So it is something, but it's not nearly enough to achieve like that tipping point of 10-15%.
But do you think there's the opportunity for a Syrian-style narrative to be built up by Western media if there is a hard crackdown on these people?
No, I don't think so, because Iran has great defense of their borders. Syria did not.
Right.
So the uprising was co-opted by militants and armed factions coming from Jordan and from Turkey, and those were U.S. and British and French trained and equipped immediately coming, and Israel as well. So, I mean, Syria was just a sieve, basically, totally porous on all ends. Iran is not like that. They're well-defended borders. They have a very good and well-organized internal defense and military system. They're much better funded, not greatly funded, but much better funded than Syria is. And they don't have the immediate threats coming at them from three different directions like Syria did. So it's a tough one, for the U.S. and the West if they think that they can pull anything like they pulled in any other country in Iran. I just don't see it happening.
Okay, and we'll just briefly end with this one then. This is the U.S. Defense Secretary. The EU must allow the United States and other non-EU allies to participate and compete for business. So what's this all about? I think the United States suddenly twigged what the European Union is up to with its defense union and what the implications are for that. So he was speaking at the NATO Industry Forum in Washington, and he said that the European Defence Fund, which is 13 billion euros pool of money, and PESCO, which of course is the program which pulls together European defence into various operations, 47 different operations underway at the moment, that these must allow the United States and other non-EU allies to participate and compete for business. Our collective strength and security hinges on our ability to bolster transatlantic defence cooperation and streamline decision-making across the alliance. Now, one of her final acts as EU High Representative, Federica Mogherini, said the EU remains open to competition or cooperation with the United States. The European Defence Fund and PESCO, however, are designed to be intra-continental affairs. So in other words, butt out. You're not getting involved in that. But Jens Stoltenberg, the head of NATO, of course, said that the fullest possible involvement by non-EU allies was really important. NATO and the EU need to complement each other. Well, of course, we already know that they do complement each other, and they're working very closely with each other to establish the EU's defence capability. But nonetheless, the United States seems to be suddenly expressing concern. Now, people on the EU side might find that a little bit ironic, since they claim at least that Donald Trump has been somewhat negative about NATO in recent months. But of course, Donald Trump hasn't been negative about NATO at all. He's negative about the lack of spending by EU nations.
He's drumming up business, basically.
Absolutely.
Is what he's doing.
So, you know, he went to the NATO headquarters, the inauguration of that, and if you remember, Patrick, he made that statement that the EU needs to start stumping up, EU countries need to start stumping up the money, that the US isn't there to pay for EU defence.
Which is a false argument, actually, by Trump. And I'm surprised more people don't call him out on that. It shows you how out to lunch and corrupt the press and the politicians are. I mean, look, if a European country is only spending 1% on defense, Trump's saying you need to spend 2% on defense. So what he's saying is you need to open up your budget to defense, and that 1% or doubling your spending. If you're only doing 1.5, you should be doing 2. That's going to double your defense budget.
Right.
And so what happens? We send the sales guys over from Boeing, Lockheed Martin. We send our trade envoys, our Chamber of Commerce, all of these different agents that we have in Washington. We'll dispatch them out to try to get deals for our companies for defense, to buy our tanks, our helicopters,
Absolutely.
our radar systems, our missile defense systems. So this is what's going on in Serbia right now. There's a competition over missile defense systems between, guess who? Russia and the United States. So, and NATO is grooming Serbia so aggressively, as they are all of the Balkan states. So this is the game. This is the game that we're in. It has nothing to do with defense, because there is no threat to Europe. There is no threat to Europe. Ask Angela Merkel herself if she's afraid of the Russians, and she'll giggle and laugh.
As she attaches to their pipeline for gas.
I guarantee it. So the whole thing is a farce, okay? Now the U.S. wants to muscle in on European defense. They want a piece of the action.
Absolutely.
They want to say, you need to open up for business. Guess what the next step is? With Trump, you don't open up, you don't let our companies in to bid for contracts, then guess what? Sanctions. Sanctions. It's coming. When the U.S. starts aggressively sanctioning its allies, then we have serious, serious problems. So we'll see.
We will, and you heard it here first. Thank you very much, Patrick. Thanks for joining us today. Thank you for joining us today. That's it for now, and we will be back at the same time, 1 p.m. on Wednesday. As usual, we'll see you then. Bye-bye.